The clerics are a support class that are all about keeping their team alive, keeping themselves alive, and maybe worshipping their deity along the way. Today we're going to cover everything you need to know about the cleric. Let's go! Let me know which domain you're picking for your cleric, and also these class guides are designed to teach you the mechanics of a class. I'll have a link to the playlist right here. So playing as a cleric is definitely a support focused class. You've got access to a bunch of healing spells as well as other types of aid spells to either buff your allies or debuff enemies, and you've also got the occasional damage spell sort of along the way, especially dependent on your subclass, which we'll talk about briefly in a little bit. But there's some unique factors when you think about considering a cleric. They have a huge amount of subclasses which give them a lot more flexibility than some of the other classes in terms of their overall playstyle and flexibility, but just generally for the most part the clerics act similar to, like, say, a paladin in terms of combat, because you will be using some sort of like melee attacks. Some turns you'll be dealing spells to heal, buff, debuff. Some other turns maybe occasionally you'll use like a damage spell, but there's definitely some flexibility in terms of the actual playstyle of the cleric. So let's break that down really, and we'll start with the races. Now, picking a race here, obviously roleplay considerations here, but depending on your subclass choice, you may want to consider picking a race that is going to add proficiencies, because the cleric is sort of lacking in the proficiencies department. You've got light and medium armor, which is great. You've got shields, which is great, but you've only got simple weapons. So you're missing a bunch of weapons, especially one-handed weapons, if you wanted to stick with sort of a sword and board sort of general setup. So maybe consider something like the dwarf for the axes and hammers, the humans and half-elves for spears, pikes, halberds and glaives, Gith or elf for the swords, and the drow for the short swords and the rapiers may be your option, but obviously here you can just pick whatever you like for role-playing perspective. Now, speaking of those subclasses, this is the core part of like a cleric's kit, and you've got tons of options here. The domain that you pick here will really focus on how you want to specialize your cleric. So we'll break these down at sort of a high level and go through each. First, the life domain is very paladin-like. You'll gain heavy armor proficiency as well as the discipline of life, which is a healing buff, and essentially for the most part your spells that you'll gain access to throughout this line are very healing or reviving allies orientated, and you'll be focused more on that general setup. The light domain gives warding flame to allow you to shield yourself with divine light, so you can give your enemies disadvantage on their attacks. You also gain access to, say, like light and fire based spells here. So if you wanted to be more of, say, like a little bit more of a caster, right, like you wanted to use some fire spells or something like that, then the light domain might be an option. The knowledge domain doesn't gain much except additional skill proficiencies and skill expertise. So for those skills that you are expertised in, you'll double your proficiency bonus. So if, say, you really wanted to focus on that route and not failing any checks. The nature is like a druidic subclass. You get Shillelagh, which is an amazing cantrip, by the way, so you can enhance your melee weapon with bludgeoning damage if you're using that specific type of weapon that Shillelagh uses. You've also got Tempest, which gives you heavy armor and martial weapons, as well as the Wrath of Storm, which allows you to strike a target back if they attack you with thunder, and they are more focused on that sort of thunder, lightning damage sort of spell route. Trickery domain, which is what Shadowheart is I guess you could similarly say it maybe is a little bit like a rogue inspired. You've got the Blessing of the Trickster, giving another creature stealth checks, plus you can charm people and disguise self, so you've got that going for you. The War domain is similar to the Tempest in that you gain heavy armor and martial weapons, but you also gain War Priest, so when you use the attack action, you may make one more weapon attack as a bonus action in that same turn. So this was definitely a lot to break down. So how do you like make that decision? So at a very high level, do you want to be more healer focused? Then go the life domain. If you want to specialize in martial damage, actually damaging enemies, then the War or the Tempest domain, go that route. Maybe you want to be a hybrid caster with still doing some melee damage, then nature or the light domain. And then the trickery domain and the knowledge domain are just very specific into what their archetypes actually are. Next, in character creation, you'll pick a deity, which is essentially what the god the cleric worships for their power. This is really just a role-playing choice. It'll give you some additional dialogue options, so pick whichever one sounds more interesting to you. The best skills here is definitely the wisdom skills, so animal handling, insight, medicine, perception, and survival. Depending on your domain choice here, you'll either gain proficiencies or extra expertise in some of these skills, so you've got the freedom here to pick what you like. In terms of backgrounds, acolyte, folk hero, guild artisan, and survival are probably the best, but pick whichever one sounds most interesting to you. For your ability points, you want to make sure your wisdom is at 17 because that is your spellcasting modifier, and then it depends on your focus. If you are going to focus on melee weapons, then get your strength to 14 and your dex dex to 12 and your con to 14. But maybe if you're going to be more of, say, a ranged spell caster, a bit more of the support route, then instead get your dex to 14 and your con to 14, because that extra dexterity will increase your armor class and your initiative, whereas you don't have to worry too much about dealing that melee damage, which you would rather do with your strength. While you're leveling up, regardless of your domain choice, you will gain access to a bunch of different spells which you'll be able to use. Sometimes you'll gain unique spells based on your domain, but for the most part, you'll just gain access to a bunch of spells that you can either prepare in your spellbook or be able to use as you see fit. When you are picking your feats, the first one to go would be ability improvement to get your wisdom to 18, so you've got that as a modifier, so you get that extra point. And for your second feat at level 8, I would say it's dependent on what sort of a playstyle you've taken your cleric. If you're focusing on that melee route, depending on the weapon you're using, you could go something like Polar Master, so you can then attack as an extra bonus action and get an extra opportunity attack when enemies enter your range. You could go Shield Master if you're focusing on a bit more of that support aspect. Even something like Sentinel sort of fits that bill as well. You could specialize in whatever armor class you're specializing in. The cleric has a lot of options, but I don't think that there's anything like a specific 100% option that you need to worry about picking. And you could also consider going the Mage Initiate for the Druid if you wanted to pick up some of the Druid spells, because you will be able to do that like Shillelagh. Say if we're talking about like the nature domain, if you are going a different route but you still want to use Shillelagh, you could go and grab that as well. Let's quickly talk about spells and cantrips. Guidance as a cantrip is amazing, so you should grab this as a cleric. Now what this allows you to do is add an extra 1d4 to any skill check that you do have, so this is fantastic to help you pass skill checks, especially some of those ones that happen in sort of the mid to late game that have ridiculous difficulty class. Sacred Flame is your main damage dealing cantrip. It's a dexterity saving throw, which a lot of enemies have high dexterity, so this will miss a lot. So it's often better to attack in different ways than use Sacred Flame, but if that's the only option to you, then obviously do that. Command is a fantastic spell that you can command a creature to, say, run away or grovel on the ground or drop their weapon. Fantastic if they have a unique weapon that you essentially want for yourself. Healing Word and like Aid and Mass Healing Word are just fantastic healing spells, which I would definitely use. Healing Word is better than Cure Wounds because Healing Word can be used from ranged, but if say you aren't like focusing on that sort of ranged aspect of the kit, then Cure Wounds isn't too bad if you've got, say, a melee character that you want to heal, but I personally prefer Healing Word for that flexibility. Aid is also a great like healing spell because it will heal your allies, but it also increases their hit point maximum, so you should do this before fights start. Spirit Guardians is fantastic damage for a melee focused cleric that you're trying to get nice and close in enemies and have them attack your cleric. You just get free damage off by doing that. So moving on to tips, right? As a cleric, because you've got a lot of spell options and you can actually prepare your own spells, you've got the freedom here to make these spell choices yourselves and change the spells you have active depending on the encounter that's in front of you. So make sure you're checking your spell book for that. And also you've got access to a bunch of concentration spells, and some concentration spells that don't expire after 10 turns, you could say cast them before fights actually start, and then you've got that effect active during that encounter without having to consume your action. I also low-key think that maybe you should go to Withers and respec Shadowheart's subclass from Trickery Domain. Just, you know, this is a personal thing for me. You can obviously not do that if you don't feel the need to, but I personally don't believe the Trickery Domain is one of the best subclasses for combat aspects. It obviously is part of her role-playing, but you can go and change it if you do like, especially updating her ability points here because they aren't great in terms of their alignment. And speaking of ability points for a cleric, you need to be aware that you will be using strength as your main like attacking modifier when you're just using melee attacks, unless you are holding a finesse weapon. So say if you want to have a higher dexterity, or say in Shadowheart's case her dexterity is higher, you're not actually gaining much benefit from using a melee weapon that doesn't have the finesse effect. So essentially what finesse allows is it allows to add your dex modifier rather than your strength modifier if your dex is higher when you make a swing with that weapon. But otherwise you can build out your cleric however you see fit, and I'd be curious to know how you do, so let me know in the comments down below. Thank you guys for watching this video till the end. Thank you to our members for supporting the channel. My name is Norza, and I hope you have a great day.